welcome Lisa Fithian. Thank you so much for being here. We're really honored to have you.
Yeah, thank you as well. Well, first of all, I'm just going to show you this if you haven't seen it yet, because this book, I never had aspirations to be a writer. I don't come from a political family. I just happened to find myself on this path, and I've walked it for a long time now. And many people said to me, Lisa, you need to write a book. And I'm like, I don't need to write a book. Like, there's plenty of books out there already. And there are a lot of great books out there already. And I train a lot of people. And I've had the privilege of being able to go to many mobilizations to meet many people. But a friend of mine said, Lisa, but only so many people can come to your trainings. And then I also realized that I did have a unique lived experience. And if something happened to me, I would take it all with me unless I left something behind. So this book, I actually started this book when my plan was when I turned 50 to take a year off and write the book. Well, I'm 59 now, because part of what happened is that Occupy happened. And I was like, shit, I can't step out of the movement when Occupy is happening. So I decided to give a year more of my life to Occupy before I went on a sabbatical. And it was in that year that I was also working with a bunch of community-based organizations around the fallout of the financial crisis. And we began to do these weeks of actions. And it was the same model of organizing that I did back in the 1990s with Justice for Janitors. And which is really my approach to how do you take on major corporations and win. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But all that being said and done, I did this 56-page manual for these community-based organizations to do these weeks of actions of shutting things down. And I did it in 2 days. I was like, I'm going to get this book done in a year. Well, 7 years later, it did come out. And part of the challenge was that I kept organizing and things keep happening. And also, I'm a street girl more than I'm a writer. But all that being said and done, there's something about trusting that things happen when they need to. And there's a way in which I feel like this book came out just before we hit 2020. And it gave me a platform to start talking with people about how do we go forward? How do we begin this new decade? Like when we came into the 2010s, we were in a moment of global uprising with the Arab Spring, watching massive revolutionary movements, going through incredible regime change that people never thought was possible. And we saw a lot of that happening in this country. And we came out of that last decade and came into this with another moment of mass uprisings until COVID came along. And we'll circle back around on that. But in terms of the book itself, it started out as a manual, and there's lots of what we call toolboxes in the book. And I actually put a bunch of them up on the website, Shut It Down Now, because as we've entered this new uprising after the murder of George Floyd, people are back on the streets trying to figure out a whole new generation is rising up. And so it's a time to share as much as I can. So the bunch of the toolboxes are up there if you want to check them out on Shut It Down Now. But it chronicles, the past 4 decades, really, looking at my life of organizing in high school and college. As part of the student government, I was president of the student government in high school and college. As coming out of college, I worked with Abby Hoffman in upstate New York, up on the St. Lawrence River, where I first started doing environmental work. And I really felt like I was on a track to sort of what I call in-system organizing, doing legislative work, et cetera. And I began to see that there was power there, but in the 80s, I became involved in organizing called the Pledge of Resistance, which was looking at nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience, trying to prevent an invasion of Nicaragua. And I'm sure some of you might have been involved in the pledge back in the days in the 80s. And it was in that work that I began to understand that the power we have is really in the streets. And that it's the popular mandate that we create in the streets that is going to force the politicians to do the right thing. So I stepped out of in-system work and went fully into the streets. And the more I was in the streets, the more I started to do direct action and civil disobedience, the more I began to see that there were other ways of living and being in relationship to people than in what I would call the dominant culture. And I started to learn about horizontal organizing and shared power and our creativity and resistance. And so let me just say that, and I'm probably going to be random tonight, and Brand, if I start going crazy, and pull me back to where I'm supposed to be, but I've really come to understand that this culture that we live in is, I know we're recording, but we're not on TV. I'll try not to curse too much, but I just have to say, the dominant culture that we live in is totally fucked. And it's killing everybody. It's a culture of death, right? That's rooted in what I call like the four supremacies: white supremacy, male supremacy, wealth supremacy, and Christian supremacy. And for every ideology of supremacy that is the foundation of this culture, there's the opposite of that, which is like everybody that's not part of one of those dominant things is seen as inferior or less. And so what I've learned is that the culture in the streets, the culture of direct action organizing, of sharing power, horizontal networks, is a culture of life. And so I've spent my life dedicating my energy into building these alternative ways of being, and particularly focusing on being anti-racist or anti-oppressive, looking at network structures as opposed to hierarchical structures, looking at how this work of building a culture of life using direct action is sacred, and everything, and it's a spiritual pursuit for me. And understanding that if we're not going to continue to perpetuate this culture of oppression, we have to very intentionally be building a culture of what, in one of my communities, we're talking about a culture of belonging. So I work in Austin. I live in Austin, Texas, although New York State is one of my homes. And my father lived in Chatham, New York. So he passed away a couple of years back. And so he's got a house in the woods, which I'm in the process of relating to, and maybe coming back to New York as my home over the next year or so. But in Austin, I work with a group called Undoing White Supremacy Austin. And I was just on a call earlier tonight with over 300 white people in our community that have signed up to start getting more active, because this moment of the murder of George Floyd is in fact challenging the dominant culture in one of the most significant ways. I know that was raised earlier about this being a tipping point. And yes, it is a tipping point, and we've been here before. But what I've tried to write about in this book is bringing together lessons of all these years of organizing, so that any ordinary person who is seeing some injustice or believing that another world is possible and they want to do something about it, hopefully giving them some stories and some tools and some ways to think critically about stuff to help them fully become an agent of change. Because, at the end of the day, I believe that we want each and every one of us to be able to be in our full power and potential. And knowing that because we live in a culture that has privileged white people for so long, white people we want to be fully in our power too, but we want it to be an accountable power, in a shared power. And creating a culture where everyone has access to what we've had access to for generations. So I don't know, let me see what else is there about the book that's important. So it tells about the work in the 80s, the Central America movement, where we actually prevented a US invasion of Nicaragua. It looks at labor organizing, particularly the Justice for Janitors campaign, which was a groundbreaking campaign because, as if you know much about the labor movement, we've been losing power for decades, but the janitors movement, bringing in a whole new way of understanding how we can organize for workers, has hugely successful, and looking at union organizing across the industry, across the country, that has been very successful. It's looking at the global justice movement and the shutdown of the WTO and how we were on the offensive and winning against the capitalists, but how we sort of, the beginning of the global war on terror sort of knocked us off of that trajectory and put us back on the defense. There's stories I wrote about my time in Ferguson when Michael Brown was murdered, and also my time at Standing Rock when we were fighting the DAPL pipeline. And I guess the last thing I'll say, and it might come up again later on, you know, there's themes that I've talked about, but the other theme that I have learned and wrote about, but am really bringing more and more into my work, is understanding the power of trauma and the importance of healing. And so I've just been trying to weave nonviolent direct action, anti-racist organizing, trauma and healing into an offering about how we might choose to intentionally live differently in this world and in this country and go forward in a way that's actually healthier for everybody. And I don't know. That's what this book is about, a lot of different things. And the exciting thing, honestly, is that I thought it could have been a disaster. I mean, writing a book is pretty terrifying. It's really putting yourself out there. And once you put words on paper, then it's like words on paper. It's like if it's real. And I knew in my lifetime that I need to be free to be different than who I was. I need to be free to evolve and to change, because in any moment I might hear something that change my perspective. So I had to get comfortable knowing that this was a snapshot of where I have been and where I was, knowing that I'm going to continue to evolve and change in everything that I do. So I don't know, do people have any questions about the books? Brandon, do you have any other prompts for it? Or I'm grateful to you for sharing, because I have gotten good feedback. People like it. So I'm very excited that it's been of value to people. Yeah, go for it. Brandon, were you trying to say something? You're muted.
Thank you. Okay, good. The control of technology.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have questions I would ask, but what I'd rather do is, we have about 5 minutes here where if there's a few people who would like to put a question into the chat box that focuses on the lessons that Lisa has learned over the past 40 years, the tools that she's developed. We're going to move next into our current state. But if you have any questions that relate to her the 4 decades of the history of organizing, please add it into the chat.
Well, I'm going to add another piece in here. Feel free to write questions in. You know, another piece of this book that was also new for me, it was learnings that took place while doing the book. My dad handed me a book called Complexity Science, the emerging science on the edge of order and chaos. And I'm like, chaos, edge of, right, I'm all about that. But I went down the rabbit hole of complexity science. And I don't know, often I ask people, like, do you know about complexity science? And most people say no. But in fact, it's all over our world. And for me, it's one of the most exciting things, because as I was reading about it, I was like, holy shit, this is the science behind why nonviolent direct action networks work. And the cliff notes on it is that we were, again, in the culture that we were raised and socialized in, it was rooted in Newtonian science from hundreds of years ago, which is very linear and very mechanistic and very like cause and effect. And you know, in the 80s, a group of scientists came together who began studying how change happens in organic living systems. And that's what has become known as complexity science, game theory, chaos theory, network theory, it all comes out of it. But it really gives us a window into understanding how change really happens. And as we learn more about it, I think it greatly enhances our ability to be effective in organizing. And so I say all of that because in complexity science, there's this concept called the edge of chaos. And that is the place where new things can emerge. And I say this because a lot of my teachings over the years, because of what I've learned, is that we have to be willing to create a crisis. We have to be willing to engage in social disruption and create crisis for the people in power who are doing harm. And so I was beginning to see that it's when we organize ourselves to create that throwdown. And if we do our organizing well and in a way that's prefigurative of what we want on the other side, we're much more likely to get there. And so as we go into this, as we're into this new decade, one of the things I like to say is that we have to be prepared to really shut things down. And I think we're seeing right now in this current uprising how fundamental change can come out of these kind of organizing strategies. So let's see if there's any other questions that came in.
Unmute me. So thank you. We got several questions, and I'm going to take one of them for now and try to weave the next ones in. But in relationship to discussion about complexity science, Larissa asks, how has organizing evolved from the labor movements in the turn of the century through the civil rights movements up to today? And I think that'll take us to our next section of the current moment. But how has that evolved?
Well, I mean, it's a tragic story, really, because, particularly in the 1930s, you had 5 million workers who were organized in 3 years because workers just shut things down using the power of strikes, of walking off the job. And so you saw massive amounts of organizing that took place that really helped form the radical labor movement and the more mainstream labor movement. And one of the things that happened back then is that there was a process called card check recognition, right? There's 2 legal ways to form unions. One is through card check. The majority of workers sign a card. You go to the boss, you say, we got the majority, recognize a union. And it was in the 30s that was the primary means by which unions were formed. And they did it because they went on strike and they just exercised their muscle. And it was in the boss's interest to get labor peace. And so many unions were formed. But then, because capitalism is so adaptable and at co-opting, what happened is that they began to created laws in the National Labor Relations Board that began to take away the power that the workers had and where we had leverage. And all kinds of things came into place, and they finally created the NLRB elections. And that's how, over the past few decades, most workers organize. Shop by shop, site by site, you do your election. If you win, then the boss is supposed to negotiate. But in at least 30 to 40% of the union elections, when the workers win, the bosses still don't negotiate because they don't respect you. They don't have to. So all that being said and done, the janitors campaign made an explicit decision to use card check recognition and not elections. Made a specific decision not to organize just by one building or site, but to organize industry-wide. Made a decision to not just use worker strategies, but to also use community strategies, media strategies, regulatory, legal strategies. It was a comprehensive campaign. Come at them from many directions, which is one of the lessons in taking on any corporation. And it took on direct action, not only strikes, but also embracing civil disobedience and shutting cities down. So you had this huge movement. It lost its power. It lost its union density. The janitors surged again. It offered a lot of lessons, but not enough unions have taken on are not willing to create the crisis that they need to create. And so we see a continual losing of power in the labor movement. And even in this moment, even with this moment of the uprising, where's labor? Where's labor right now? So again, it's like on everything, the solutions exist. Things have happened before, but we don't always learn the lessons, or we don't carry them forward. And mostly because we are afraid. And so many of the institutions, the nonprofits, the community-based organizations, the labor unions, are all see themselves as part of that Democratic Party machine. They all work on a hierarchical model, just like the dominant culture. And so what you have is you have people at the top who begin to amass some resources and offices and staff, and then they become more afraid of taking greater risk because they have institutional things to preserve and protect. And so unfortunately, we don't have a lot of people that are willing to do what it takes to create deep change. And so, and that's was one of the questions about what do we do? You know, what we see in terms of the pattern over and over again, something happens, there's an uprising. I like to use the word uprising. And it happens on the edges. Occupy was like this, Ferguson was like this current movement is like this. But what happens is that all the mainstream organizations are usually hesitant to get involved at first, right? Because it's scary, they're in the street, they're blocking highways, right? So they don't really necessarily support it. But then it becomes obvious that there's a lot of power there, and there's a lot of momentum there, and there's an important message there. And so the groups start to move in, thinking about, oh, how can I harness this energy? How can I get everybody here to go vote? How can I get them to call city council, right? And so there's the mainstream groups start pulling that raw power into the center, co-opting it and killing it. And that's how our movements die. Instead of saying, there's this raw energy and power, how do we keep supporting and fueling it to sustain it so that it can go as long as possible? And I've been saying to groups here in New York, I'm in New York right now. I was talking to a friend as we were marching across the Brooklyn Bridge, who's with a community-based group. I'm like, please, whatever you all do, please don't co-opt this too fast. Because we know they're going to do it, but don't do it too fast. And the other thing I've learned over the years is inside outside. You know, I want to see radical change. I'd like to see the state come down as we know it. But it's not going to happen like that. And so while we're creating the alternatives, there will still be in-system things that have to happen. And we're seeing it around police right now, which is fantastic. But I want to always make sure that we're working intentionally inside and outside, because again, it's very easy for the people on the inside to throw away the people on the outside, to use them, but then to cut the deals. And we can't have that either, right? So how are we always in right relationship? And how are we, especially those of us that are white, or those of us that have power in institutions or labor, how are we not continuing to center ourselves, but using our energies as accomplices to support the voices of the people who are on the front lines right now? You have a lived experience that has to change. So yeah, it's going to be really amazing to see what happens. So maybe I'll leave it at that, Brandon, see where you want to go next.
Well, you've really taken us right to where we were planning on going, which is to talk about the current moment, how it compares to the past, that we're in an unprecedented current tidal wave of protest. How are these being organized so successfully? Is this a radical transformation? What are the lessons learned? If we could just focus on that for a while, and then what we can see is after that, we're going to move to direct action strategies at this time, because that's where a lot of these questions that are bubbling up in the chat window are coming. But let's just give a moment to this unprecedented current tidal wave of protest, and you asked several questions that respond to it. What are some of your reflections on strategies to really move to the next level and network communities and be of support? What can we do?
Mm-hmm. Well, I just have to say that it's like one of these perverse times, because I'm thrilled at what's happening. I'm thrilled at this uprising. I'm a nonviolent activist, but when that police station was burned in Minneapolis, I was like, right on. I'm just going to be straight about this. I am so very, very sorry that so many Black and brown folks have been murdered by the police or other white supremacists. It's like this weird thing of people shouldn't have to die for us to rise up like this. It shouldn't, like, we should be shutting things down without people having to die, but that's what it is. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a long history of resistance to white violence, back to the founding of this country. Indigenous people resisted, enslaved people resisted. Throughout history, people have resisted. And there have been uprisings. Rodney King, back in 93, led to riots, the murder of right. So there have been riots, uprisings that have happened as the result of the murder of Black people in this country. When Trayvon Martin was killed, that was the beginning of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. When Michael Brown was killed, that was another moment, a new wave of the Black liberation movement that spread across this country and made race a national discussion. But then when Heather Heyer was murdered in Charlottesville, it made white supremacy an easier conversation to have. Like, all of a sudden, we could start using the words white supremacy, which people weren't talking about before. And so these are all important, but what happens is these surge moments, but then particularly the white folks go back to their lives until the next moment. So now comes George Floyd. And, I don't want to go too far into COVID, but part of what happened is because we were in the middle of a pandemic. But what happened is that, this political moment, what's different in this recent era, obviously it's like social media, filming, the story gets out. But the murder of George Floyd was like, I don't know, it was just like, once again, the straw that broke the back. I mean, you're literally watching a man plead for his life. And the cops just keep kneeing him. And it just was like too much. And then it spread like wildfire. It just spread across the country. And there's a momentum that happens, right? It's like, just like Occupy, something happened, then it spread. It spread again. And what's different about it is that people have had enough. And this new generation, again, you saw massive highway blockades after Michael Brown was murdered. And so it was a tactic that people had some experience with. And so you saw that again. Yes, in some places you saw buildings burn. Happened in Ferguson. You saw stores broken into, right? And it's like one of these moments that what we've been waiting for. I mean, it's like, when I went on this book tour in the fall, I was agitating people to say, let's go to Washington, D.C. Let's swarm the White House. Let's have our Tahrir Square moment. Let's just shut it down and get rid of Trump. And then when impeachment came around, a bunch of us went to D.C. trying to provoke large numbers of people to show up. Nobody came. We were like, what the hell is going on with this country? Nobody came. But now it's happening. People have swarmed the White House. There's a contest for power. People are in the streets all over the country. There's tremendous, brilliant leadership. at least here in New York City, very multiracial, very multi-generations, a beauty in the streets, a lot of care for one another, tremendous self-organizing, and that's again part of direct action. It's like people self-organizing to take care of themselves and each other. So there's people all over at every protest offering water, food, masks, hand sanitizer. There's no central command here, right? It's people who've had enough, who are in the streets, looking out for one another, sharing what they have, and also being brave. I mean, it's so weird. It's like, that was the other thing I was saying before this happened. It was like, during COVID, I was talking a lot about mutual aid and how it might form how I believe the mutual aid networks that spread so rapidly and radically were the foundations of the resistance networks that we are going to need if Trump should try and abort the election or give up. Like, we need serious community defense and resistance networks. And we needed to recognize that if that was to happen, we were going to have to come out of our homes and we were going to have to retake the streets, COVID or not. But this current movement is doing all of that right now. It says we're not staying home anymore. We're taking over the streets and we're going to risk it all. And people are trying to be as safe as possible. But there comes a point in time where it's like, enough is enough. And that's where we are. And I just can't tell you how grateful I am to all the young leaders who are standing up, the high school kids, who are standing up. We need to support them. And I don't know where it's going to go. But I hope that we can sustain the street protest for a long time, and that we can learn, because that's the other thing about these things. And you saw it in Ferguson too. Again, there's that raw power, that resistance in the streets. Organizations come in, try and mold it, co-opt it, put a lot of money in. And eventually the energy gets diffused and people get tired and want to go home. And some groups carry on that work. We're going to need to figure out how to support this new generation of organizers, whether it's with food or cash, and try and keep it in the streets as much as possible. That's where I really think that we need to go. Because once it gets co-opted into the organizations and into the elections, nothing more radical is going to happen. And we need radical change. We need to defund the police. We need to abolish the police. We need to talk about reparations. We need to actually start changing the narrative about what this is about. And the police have been the shock troops for the white supremacists since the founding of this country. And now that they've been militarized, they are very dangerous. And they need to be demilitarized. They need to be defunded. And there are examples of communities in this country that have fired their entire police forces. There are examples of new community policing models. And here in New York, the governor has now thrown down this mandate where every police station has got to re-envision itself and work with the community to think about what that could look like. I think it's Camden, New Jersey, in fact, has done something similar to this already to great effect. So there are models we need to, and more of that's going to start emerging as other examples. But yeah, I think we need to keep pushing this as far as we possibly can.
And that's a perfect transition into us moving into this section talking about direct action strategies and risks under, especially in the midst of the pandemic. I think I'll read a couple. I'm just going to take a handful of the questions that you could just integrate into a discussion however you want. But from Dan Pfeiffer, there's a question. I was part of the October XR action at Wall Street, wondering about how you think it went and how to adjust the strategies in the pandemic conditions that we are in. Dave and a few other people have asked, what are the most effective tactics that you've used when dealing with well-funded corporate polluters? Judith Ank is asking, many of us are not going out in crowds until there's a vaccine because of health issues. How do we organize without being able to physically show up? What are the best practices? And there's a question from Facebook that came in. Based on your experience, what can we do? Mid-30s, 2 kids, full-time job. What can we do in our local communities to drive to true change? Maybe, these are some of the questions you already responded to, the abolish the police question, but we just have a period of time now where we could hear your ideas about strategies and risks, how to do direct action under COVID, and how to build alliances and network.
Yeah. Okay. Lots of things. I'm going to go lots of places. And I do see one as just being involved in nonviolent direct action. Can it be emotionally healing and psychological for folks? I believe it can be if we do well.
Yes.
But I think we have to remember that our movements have also been infected by the ideologies of supremacy and the dominant culture. So our movements have been pretty toxic over the years. And so I think we are being invited to evolve and emerge and work in healthier ways. And understanding that, again, we can't help but be traumatized living in this culture. So that's one of the things that we need to understand, so that we're not spreading trauma around. So one of the things there is no one tactic and there is no one strategy. We need a multitude of them. We need to come from many different directions. And one of the things in any of this work is understanding that there may be some research that we need to do to really hone in on who we're going up against, how do we access them, what are the different ways we can move them. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next section. But let me just say back to some of these other things. So how do we get involved? One of the first things is whether you can go out in the streets or not. Who in your community or area, in terms of the most marginalized folks, Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, poor folks, who's already organizing? What are they already doing? Because I think, one of you who wrote via Parents, 2 Kids, How Do We Drive True Change? Well, part of it is like, how do we support the people who are most affected drive the change, right? How are we as the white people not determining what we think should happen, but how are the people that are most impacted with a lived experience supported so that they can be agents of change and talk about what's needed, right? And then how do we support that? And for those of us that are white, one of the things that we have access to a lot is money or raising money. So how do we think about moving money from here or resources over to communities that are actually already organizing? How do we, in this moment at home, take this as an opportunity to do our own? Because we have to understand that change happens at many levels. There's personal, institutional, and cultural. And it's simultaneous. So as we start to change ourselves, then our work is going to be different in community and the culture starts to change. Or when the culture starts to change, it moves in institutions. It's going in both directions all the time. So while we're home, this is a really great time for those of you that are white to do a lot more self-education about racism and white supremacy, how it impacts us, how we've all been made sick by it or traumatized by it, and to do some healing work so that we can show up in better relationships to our Black, Brown, Indigenous brothers and sisters. And as a man named Clea Benally wrote a great piece called Accomplices, Not Allies. How do we as white people begin to see ourselves as accomplices with skin in the game in these struggles? Not just the allies who are there to help people because we're the good people, right? We have to rearrange our brains and our understanding about how we enter into this work of social change. And a lot of folks have been doing this through the mutual aid work during COVID. This mutual aid work, I think, has been super important because it's a basis of self-organizing. It's actually a radical concept. I used to think of it as coming out of the anarchist community. But when I again heard Clea Benally on a webinar, he says it's not an anarchist concept, it's a law of nature. In indigenous communities, we know that if somebody in our community is in need, we all suffer. So we take care of one another. That is the nature of our relationship. So mutual aid is a law of nature. And I loved that, right? Because, we are raised to put value on things that we don't need, right? But what COVID and this pandemic has taught us, it has taught us about what is really essential: shelter, food, healthcare, right? Clean air and water. So we, through the crisis of the pandemic, were given a window and an invitation to radically rethink our relationship to life and the systems that we're living in. And we were also able to see that so many of the things that we had been fighting for decades were coming true overnight. I mean, sick days for people, clean water was happening, reduction in oil use, discussion of universal wages, debt reduction, all of this stuff started happening. And again, as we knew, but became clear, the only problem we have is the lack of political will to do the right thing. And so we were coming out of this period of going into pandemic, the world is changing, edge of chaos. People start to self-organize because they understand that people in their community, poor folks, Black folks, are going to get screwed because they've always gotten screwed. So a whole redistribution campaign was being set in motion. And it was been working. And so one of the things that we've been talking about in mutual aid networks is to say, hey folks, people were poor before the pandemic, right? So let's not stop this when the economy comes back. Let's continue to build relationships, build systems of alternative economies. Because the system as it wasn't working for anybody anyway, unless you were white, male, and rich. So, and Brandy, you said earlier, when I think about social change, I think that there's two fundamental strategies. One is dismantling the institutions, ideologies, processes that do harm, while we're simultaneously building up ways of thinking, ideologies, values, institutions that support liberation. It's a simultaneous process. Because if we tear everything down, people want to know where they get their bread. But now, when the systems come down, we have a mutual aid network and people now know where to get their bread. In fact, in Minneapolis, the neighborhood where that 3rd precinct was, all the food stores, they're no longer functional. So all the churches have opened up and they've set up this whole network where people in the suburbs do mass shopping, bring everything into the churches, which are now set up as basically free stores. So everybody in the neighborhood can now go to the church to get what they need without having to pay for it. It's this amazing thing that's coming into place. You might have seen in Seattle, they're setting up these autonomous zones, right? It's like what the Zapatistas did in Mexico. Indigenous zone, Zapatista. We don't care about state power. We want to live in community and take care of each other. So again, we're in a moment where we're getting glimmers of how other worlds could be, how we could be in different relationship, economic, social, political relationship to one another. And so, I don't know, I just think it's an amazing time. And some of my teachers have shared that, colonization stripped us of our imagination. And really right now, we are called to imagine how it could be different. And knowing that if we can imagine something, we can create something different. And that's part of where we're like, let's not worry about going back. Let's really take this moment to imagine how as far as we could go, and then put our energy there.
I've gotten a few private messages noting that although this group is predominantly white, it is not entirely white, and that the feedback you gave mainly addressed how white people should respond to this moment. Can you add, a response to the people of color who are on this call and their role right now?
Well, I mean, um, uh, as a white person, it's a little uncomfortable for me to tell people of color what I think their role should be. But what I will say is that I believe that we all, no matter what your race, your gender, we all have an obligation to take action despite whatever fears may hold us back. We all can take greater risks, but everyone has to assess what risks they can take. And the risk I can take as a white woman may be different than the risk of a Black person. But that's not up for me to say, right? And there have been, a lot of times people say to me, Lisa, civil disobedience and direct action is just really for the privileged white people. And I'm always like, it's easier for white people to do it, but it's not. Every movement of every race, ethnicity has engaged in direct action and or engaged in civil disobedience. So it's not a white way. But, the more people can do, and that's the other thing I'll just say. It's a Rumi poem. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. There are so many ways that people can get involved right now, whether it's like giving people rides, making sure there's food at protests, helping to raise money. I don't know what your gifts or skills are. If you're a medical person, maybe you can go out in the streets and be a street medic. Maybe you can be at home making bagged lunches that somebody else can deliver to the protests. Maybe you can do phone banking, right? There's a lot of different ways. So there's a role for you no matter who you are, what your ability is, and no matter what your risk is. So the important thing is that we all do something, and that we also understand this is not just for this moment, but it's life work. I do think that we're in an era and have been for a long time where that the leadership of people of color, Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, depending on the issue and what's happening, is paramount. And that those of us that are white, it's important for us to step back, to listen, to learn, to not think that we know the way out of this. And it's not about giving up our power. Nobody's being asked to give up their power, but we are being asked to not center ourselves in this work. So, I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but yeah.
I think you are. Here's another question, and this is for somebody who this question relates also to the last question. I have a question about institutions that insist on staying neutral. They may fear losing their funding if they get political, but there really is no neutral in racism and climate crisis. Are there strategies you have for getting institutions and nonprofits to come along? For example, Starbucks wouldn't let employees wear BLM gear, but then reverse that stance. From Amazon to food pantries, they are afraid of taking political risk. And you also, if you could talk about that in relationship to what you also said about how when these corporations do get involved, how they can co-opt the streets. So can you talk a little bit about this complex situation?
Sure. I agree with you too, the person who asked, Alexis, that there is no neutral, right? There's like power, every decision we make is a choice, and it's either going to liberate or oppress. There's no neutral choices. And I agree with that. And are there strategies? I mean, this is like, it's always, this is the organizing work. It's how do you get them to do the right thing? And so, it's like, I have seen moments where we've been able to build larger formations. So there are definitely ways. I mean, one way is to just push them and ask them, just, and if you're inside of them, to push them and ask them. Another way is to, it's always built on relationships. Who do you know? So on any organizing in this moment, it's like, who do we know? Whom do we want to know? How do we start building authentic relationships and getting to really know each other and value each other as human beings, not just as transactional people that can deliver something for us, which is what the organizations tend to do, very transactional, where we're really building for transformative change. So one of the ways I do it is these large campaigns of like shutting cities down, because when you're doing these large form campaigns, there's ways for, so I guess short of doing a strategy workshop, there's a thing called interests, right? What do people care about? So what are the interests of the labor unions or these bigger institutions? And then figuring out based on their interests, what they might be able to do to push things a little bit further. So we did get a bunch of unions involved in doing a bunch of big actions in New York City a couple years back. And part of the reason we did it, we said, we're going to do daily actions and we're going to run brigades. Can you send staff or members into this? And we'll train them. So we invested in their people to train them how to do these action stuff. So it's like trying to find out what they care about and finding a way or that they can pull them in to some niche that they can be comfortable with in the context of a larger campaign where you're doing all these other forms of action. But it's hard. I mean, if they would all come out and be bold and brave, we might have the change that we want, but they're not doing that yet. So I guess one of the things I say, and I write in the book a lot, is that whoever you're working with, it's important to develop a set of agreements, whether it's in the streets or among the different types of players, so that we can form a basis of trust of what we can expect from one another, because that's part of it. Since we've been pitted against each other for so many decades, we have got to find a basis of trust and understanding that we may not all do the same thing, but how do we make sure that we're not doing each other harm, or that we're adding value to one another, so that we can say to the folks, like, we know you're not going to go shut the streets down, but we are. And we know that that's going to create the fire that's going to give you some leverage, but let's make sure that we're on the same page about what is the reforms that we want. So we just have to really get to a higher level of building some trust through agreements among the different players, so that we have a relationship, so that if things go wrong, we're accountable to one another. Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for that. I wish I had a good answer for getting these entities to do the right thing.
Well, this is an opportunity for us to take a transition and try to get into Lisa Fithian's mind and see, okay, how would this mind solve a new problem, right? So we have an actually old new problem in the capital region of New York, the Norlight Incinerator. And we're wondering if we could just spend the next 15 minutes using this as a kind of hypothetical / real site for direct action. How would you approach it? And we know that you don't necessarily know this history, which is a decades long struggle actually, but some of the people who are right on this call have actually really felt their potential for making change with their initial organizing. And so if we asked you, how do you start a campaign? How does inquiry and interrogation begin that campaign? What are some of the preliminary considerations on how to approach a campaign, such as target mapping, strategic campaigning, escalating resistance, map power holders? If you were going to talk to us and think about how to advise us about really creating a successful campaign to shut down this toxic danger in our community, how do you approach designing a campaign, a local campaign that connects to a national campaign?
Right. And I was looking to see if I could actually share a slide. Well, a couple things. So in any kind of campaign, the first question you always want to ask is who has the power to decide? So who's got the power to decide whether or not this incinerator continues or not? And it's important to figure that out because these institutions are very skilled at getting you onto distractions or people that have no power. So that's why, is it Norlight LLC or is it that Tradeby? And who are the people? So there's always got to be, in my opinion, some research done. So research on the people, the CEOs, the boards, shareholders, executive management. There's one layer. Another piece I look for is where are they? Physical locations. Where are their headquarters? Where are their offices? Where are their other work sites? Because, you know, when I think about these things, like this is kind of like a war. And this, you have to figure out the strategic playing field. And you have to know where you're going to fight them. And in any war, there's like the ground war, but there's also the air war. And in the realm of social media, there's lots of ways to get at them virtually. The other thing I do is I look at a physical map. You know, so I started to pull up a map of the plant right then. I haven't had a chance to look at it, but it looked like there was maybe 1 or 2 roads into the incinerator, right? One to the north and one to the south. There may be more than that, but what's that terrain? Like if you wanted to just physically, literally shut it down, all access, like where would you do that? So once you know who has the power to decide and who the main corporation is, then I do what's called power mapping. I map their world. Who are all their players? Because one of the things I've learned is that even though the power of the people is mighty, they don't give a shit about us. And so one of the ways that we have to get them to care about us is that we have to start disrupting their world. So I talked earlier about interests. Usually corporations care about money, their ability to do their business, and their image. So we have got to do things that cost them money, disrupt their ability to do business, and tarnish their image. So another part of the research is what I call looking for dirt, getting on LexisNexis, all the different lawsuits, just finding out anything you can about this company of why they're bad. Because you're trying to create a narrative for the public about how they are bad on every bad, and bad, right? And then you need to escalate an escalation campaign, because part of what you have to do is you're going to the company and their players. So they may have shareholders, there may be regulatory, there may be industry analysts, there may be, you know, the CEO's club where he goes. So we start doing tactics at all these other players who then go back to their primary decision maker. So what you want is for your decision maker to all of a sudden feel like their entire world is being hit by us. And they're all calling him like, why are these people at our luncheon at the industry association event, right? Or why are they in this building? So you're just trying to like get them from every direction. So that's internally, but externally, you're trying to escalate and bringing the public along with you. So you might go to the decision maker and say, all right, we want you to shut down and do X, Y, and Z. If they say yes, great, you've won. If they say no, you escalate again. And so you're building a public narrative that you've given this corporation the opportunity to do the right thing, but they keep doing the wrong thing. And so at some point that gives you justification for fully shutting it down, because you've exhausted all other means and all civil ways of trying to get them to do the right thing. Because I believe that you have to be willing to put them out of business, right? What would it take to put them out of business? Because at the end of the day, if they want to keep their business going, it will ultimately become in their interest to stop burning all everything in order to shut you all down. But actually, hopefully the goal is to shut the incinerator down completely, which is a winnable campaign as far as I'm concerned. And in fact, they won that in Chicago. No, I think it was in Detroit. There was an incinerator in Detroit, and they were actually able to shut it down. So shutting incinerators down is possible. And I understand this is a big one and it gets a lot, but trying to shut it down would be good. So escalation, doing lots of creative tactics. I always like to do actions that tell the story. So maybe they have a headquarters in Albany, which is near some other power player. Maybe you're getting a bunch of smoke in balloons or smoke bombs. Maybe you're setting up a thing where you're creating this smoke outside the governor's office. Time to shut this down. I'm just saying lots of stuff. Maybe I don't know what it is, but trying to find creative ways and a picture that tells the story of what you're trying to do is important. So, yeah, I mean, I always like to look at industry associations. So they are often, it's the place where everybody in that industry comes together. So their competitors will be there, but it's like, those are great places to also do actions at because you're now creating disruption for the whole industry. I don't know what else. I have always lots of slideshows of things, but maybe I should see if there's some specific questions people have about any of this stuff.
We're in the perfect time to do that. So let's open it up for questions, and actually we will give you the mic. You don't have to chat. If you let us know, feel free to, we'll end with questions.
Judith, see your hand.
Steve, can you give Judith the mic? Why don't you just unmic? Yeah, thank you.
So thanks, Lisa. I appreciate your comments. I'm a little skeptical about influencing Norlight, when their parent company is in Spain. And I agree, you have to always start with who's the target, who has the power. So I'm wondering why the target would not be a governor or a mayor or a regulator that doesn't have a financial interest in just, accepting massive amounts of liquid hazardous waste to be burned. Why the target the company, which seems the hardest to me? Why not someone in government who has the legal authority to shut them down?
Mm-hmm. Well, that may be who you want to go for. And actually, one of the things I've learned is just who has the power to decide, but then everybody else has multiple targets. So if the governor has the power to shut them down, he's a good target, So that may be, is that who you're focusing on?
Well, we really haven't had a grassroots campaign yet. We've just kind of been in a state of emergency since February, since learning about this new PFAS chemicals. But I would think that an elected official would be more concerned about the community and not driven just by how much money they make. Some of them have a good track record, some of them do not. But I just think it's easier to deal with elected officials who have some degree of accountability as opposed to a company that doesn't really care because they've been poisoning the community for decades.
Well, I would make an argument that I'm not sure the politicians care either, because I think they know a lot of the times that this is happening and they just let it happen. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't go after them because they should have some accountability. And so I think part of the art here is you have to be able to tell the story of why Norlight is so bad and corrupt and criminal. And then you have to pressurize this politician about not being associated with them, right? So you have to sort of taint the politician with Norlight as well, so that the politician wants to actually separate from them and not be associated with them. And so some of it, like in any, so is there any way to make it so I can share a screen?
Yes.
Do something, just share this real quick. So this would be an example of a real life mapping I did of Express Scripts, the pharmaceutical company, George Paz, and this is an example of the mapping, the board, the clients, all these different players. But what you understand is that this is a relationship between George and the board members and George and whatever. And in this relationship, we try and bring new information. And it might be a carrot, it might be a stick. So in your particular situation, the politician, your argument might be to them, listen, this is your opportunity to be a hero and to save these communities. And like, you might like try and bolster them up, right? Or it might be, listen, your association with this company is going to bring you down. You're going to lose the election unless you really take a leadership role on this, right? Because we know that you've given investments or something. So you need to know the relationships between these players and as much as you can about the company. Because I do think they are the evil ones. And then the politicians, because I often talk, when I talk about creating social crisis, like with the janitors, we knew it was the building owners we had to move. But we made a decision to shut the whole city down. Because it was like these rich real estate guys who are the major players in the city. And we knew that if we could create enough disruption, the politicians would come in and solve it. So in any big dispute, you always look for who might the settlers be, because the community and the organization or corporation might come in such loggerheads. There's no way for them to actually really settle anything. So it's very likely that the politicians will come in to solve the dispute. So maybe what's happening with this is that the community's grassroots campaign is shutting down that major road that it's on again and again and again, that's disrupting the city. So it's now in the politicians' interest, just on the functioning in the city, to try and deal with this incinerator. So that's the other thing. It's like, what are all the arguments against the incinerator? What's the pay of the workers? How do they treat the workers? What's the angle on that? What's the, do they have previous lawsuits? The health impact on the community. So you can have all the 10 top reasons why this is bad. But I think you have to really get that story tight and all those reasons so that the politicians it's going to be undisputable to the politicians that they have to do something differently here. And this plant's been around for a long time, right? So the politicians know all about this plant. So the question is do they know or do they not know? And then if they don't know, well, then we're going to educate them so that they do know. And then once they do know, then if they don't do the right thing, you're justified in really going after them harder, occupying their offices, making their life very difficult. Because they are making the life of people in that community not only difficult, they're making the life of the people in that community potentially deadly. You can do sick-ins, coffins, die-ins, things like that. But yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question? Just, you could raise your hand. Dave, Steve, can you give Dave the mic, please?
Hey, okay, so actually, as you were speaking, I was typing in a lot of stuff because I'm pretty much in agreement with you. We've been kind of one-dimensional with this so far. There are, I mean, I've done a lot of activism, a lot of direct actions, and this plant is very tricky in that way because it's a massive sprawling location with, you are correct, two main entrances, and it's unless you have like really significant numbers, it's really difficult to occupy. and they would have to be people that are really willing to be entrenched, be there for a long period of time, definitely get arrested. So, but I think you've definitely hit on something in terms of trying to get Trade-to-Be to bleed money. The thing about Norlight is, I mean, you asked how long this thing has been in existence. I mean, yes, it has been here for decades and decades, but I think Trade-to-Be only acquired it maybe 10 years or so ago, and they are an international corporation with a standard board. As you've been speaking, I've been Googling the board members, and yes, they do mostly live abroad. So, but I just want to say, I think you've hit on something. The other thing to maybe look at too is not just the weaknesses of Norlight and Trade-to-Be themselves, but the companies that are selling their toxins to them, because some of those toxins are coming from states, like state of New Hampshire, state of Vermont, and they are definitely vulnerable to public inquiry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things, these big corporations, there's a lot of people around the world that will do solidarity action. So I think, that's one thing to think about, again, escalating too. And yeah, just doing those maps. I mean, that's like another example, like when we did working on the tar sands blockade, so the organizers did a map of all the different, the corporate people, as well as who all the clients were and offices, et cetera. So, again, so as you think about this campaign, there may be a piece on the story of Norlight, but who are the international opportunity? I could talk about opportunities for engagement. What are all the opportunities for engagement? So you've got the politicians, you've got the states that are sending it, you've got the corporations that might be sending it. So who's like sending it? Who are the clients that send stuff? Who are the decision makers, the regulatory agencies? Who's profiting around the world? Like, just get that whole map. And then you can start thinking about, what are the different opportunities within each of those areas for actions. So let me go back to that slide for 1 minute. So when we were doing this mapping, again, it's like, we knew that Express Scripts had clients that in the healthcare industry, they had a contract with the Department of Defense, they had contracts with the Presbyterian Church, this other church, they had contracts with unions, right? So these clients, we had a different strategy for each of them to try and get them to break with them, right? We knew that in the industry, there were these particular analysts that would always write about it. So we knew to target those analysts. So with every part of their world, you can then break it down even further. And then within each of that, think about other tactics. And so like, for example, here, we also knew that they had places in Philadelphia, there were things we could do. There were places in Harrisburg around this campaign, places in St. Louis where their headquarters were, places in New York. It turned out that one of the board members of Express Scripts was also on the board of 5 other corporations in New York City. So we took a van of workers into New York City and we went to each of those, Fidelity, right? And we went into the main offices and said, we have a letter for Steve Sherman. We're not leaving until he gets it, right? So we're going into corporations that have nothing to do with Express Scripts other than the fact that they have somebody on their board that's also on that board. But we're wreaking havoc in those buildings. They're calling the police now on us. We get out before the police come, but they knew we were there. So again, and then we knew that we could do mailings to the DOD. We did, we just came up with tactics for each of these different players. This is the escalation map. Let me just see if there's anything else here. No, I think that's all I wanted to show. But so just doing some, and again, I'm happy to, oops, did I just stop share? I'm happy to share with you, my book has a lot of this stuff in it, but I have a little manual that's called Kicking Corporate Booty, which has got some of the same thinking, because you might decide to, after you do more research, to build up to a week of action, right? Because the one thing about building towards a week of action, you're trying to create a sense of crisis for the company or the politicians. And there's a way in which if you choose a week that might have some relevant dates because there's either a regulatory commission hearing or something the company's doing, but other opportunities to pressurize around that. And you know, that area that you're in is not a huge area, the Albany. I mean, it's sort of big, but you could create a lot of havoc for, you know, players in the state government. Yeah.
Well, thank you. We are extending this. We started 10 minutes late, so we have 7 more minutes. And we really appreciate you looking at the case study of Norlight, but we also want to open it up. I know, Dan, you had a question about Extinction Rebellion. Do you want to bring that up in the midst of all of this?
There we go. Yeah, I mean, as I was listening to all this, I was also thinking about all the people who are right now protesting for the first time and the impulse that we all have to keep momentum going. And I think that kind of outreach effort is something that Extinction Rebellion has done well so far. But, you know, I think a lot of us are preoccupied with the pandemic and how difficult it makes our actions and just people's risk tolerance recedes. A lot of people who were at a protest here a couple Sundays ago have been waiting 2 weeks, you know, in order to make sure they didn't get sick. And I don't know. So I'm just wondering, like, how practically speaking we keep those newcomers energized, if you have any thoughts about strategies there.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard in Extinction Rebellion right now for a multitude of reasons. But in any movement, keeping people engaged and active can be challenging. And so I think that's actually one of the reasons why I like having a multi-strategic approach on campaigns, because people can have different points of entry. If you like media, you might be doing some media stuff, or if you like art, you might be doing some art stuff. One thing I know is that this work is really hard, and so you also have to have fun. Like, people aren't going to come just to be in a very difficult, painful thing all the time, but that there's life giving there, and our creativity is fun. So like, lots of culture, music, art is really important in this work to sustain us. Doing things where people are building community, building relationships. We stay in the movements, not so much because of the issues. We stay in our movements because of the people and the friendships that we build. And that's what keeps us in it for the long haul. I mean, Extinction Rebellion is tricky because, you know, if you look at Extinction Rebellion, whose vision was to have mass social disruption, to get the governments to do the right thing, versus this new Black uprising, or this multiracial uprising under the Black leadership. You know, both are life and death. One more visceral than the other. But it's, you know, it's like, you know, I just say Extinction Rebellion is really white. It's really cautious. It's really like afraid. You know, if you look at this uprising right now, it's like, it's raw, it's powerful, there's heart, there's like, you know, there's like passion, there's, you know, and there's like a fuck it, because we've had enough. When you are living on the margins and have a lot less to lose, there is a culture of community that exists in order to survive all the legacy of oppression. And white folks don't have the same understanding of what that's like. And so it's not a surprise to me that Extinction Rebellion was not able to get as quickly into a level of resistance. And it's playing it safe. It's playing it safe. And a lot of the tactics that I see Extinction Rebellion do, I'm like, okay, this is all kind of cool, but it's not commensurate to the crisis that we talk about. And so, like, I have much less hope right now for Extinction Rebellion in this country. I have a lot more hope that the courageous actions of this movement for Black liberation will teach a lot more white people about the importance of really throwing down with your heart, and taking risks and taking care of each other in community. And to understand that you can't separate the climate crisis from the human crisis that we're dealing with because of racism. They're intricately connected because it's the same forces that enslaved Black folks and launched a genocide against the indigenous people. It's the same school that has also raped the earth and extracted these resources, you know, and been willing to use violence and all. It's the same thing, which is why I'm so proud of Extinction Rebellion in the US, that we have that fourth demand and we're willing to talk about reparations and the rights of Mother Nature, right? That's an essential part of this work.
Wow, well, that opens us up to a whole new session, I think, where we really focus on environmental racism, and look at the whole environmental movement, and how critical it is to understand the racism that's at the core, that you say that's historic. Do you have any final words or that you want to say as we to say goodbye to us, or that we can, you know, think about as we move forward now, each in our own struggle and networking together to try to make positive change at this point and try to help heal some of the trauma?
Well, there's, I'm typing into the book in the chat box, and I'm not having my glasses on, so I might have it wrong, but there's a book called My Grandmother's Hands, which I recommend everybody read. It's about the history of racialized violence in the US. And it's full of somatic practices of how to heal the trauma, both individual and group practices. So there's a lot of wisdom coming out on all this stuff. That's one thing. Second thing, I like to talk about, like, the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. We've been doing a hell of a lot of insanity in our country for a very long time. And in our movements, we keep doing the same thing over and over again and not getting different results. But the pandemic has come along and we're getting results. And now we're in this current uprising and we're seeing some very entrenched things begin to change. So one of the things I just like to say to all of you is, one, if you say you can't do something, slow down enough and check yourself. Is it that you can't, or that you're not willing to because you're afraid of the risks? And then ask yourself if you can take a greater risk. Because if you do believe that the climate is collapsing, and if you do see that we have a rise of authoritarian governments around the world, and that the fascist white supremacists are in fact shock troops for the current administration, things could get ugly or uglier. And so we are actually in one of those moments. There's this choice moment about how do we just get through this and everything's going to be okay, which it's not. Or how do we really start being different? So it's like, if you start seeing yourself do something that you've always done it that way, again, pause and say, is there a new way to go forward, right? So how do we spend a lot more time imagining, creative, talking with one another, building our relationships? I often like to say in my book, take each other's hands. We are going to have to take each other's hands and walk through the fire. There's no going around it, under it, or over it. We have to go through this fire. We have to do it together, right? We have to be brave, and we have to do it with love. You know, I mean, that's what we've got. And, you know, and we have to create crisis. We have to shut shit down, and we have to do it in a significant way. You know, we're in the fight for our lives, really, and in the fight for humanity, and fight for this planet. And You know, that is a war being waged, and we didn't start it, and we don't want it, but we have to decide if we're fighting, and if we are, how we're fighting. And we do the best that we can, and we have to learn to like not beat ourselves up. We do the best that we can, and that's what we do. And we can win. That's the other thing. It's so easy to think that it's too big, it's too insurmountable. Right? That's what the state wants us to believe. There is no alternative. This is inevitable, but it's bullshit. Things can change. We can win things. It's not inevitable, and it's up to us to create. We really do have that power. So that's what I'm like. Let's just go for it. Like, let's just go for it.